to talk to you about scientific management and then lead into talking about the human relations theory of management. So as you recall from reading about bureaucracy and then reading about Taylor's approach to scientific management, we can see that scientific management was an effort that was centered on controlling workers and really and what it did is really elevate the management process. So where before managers hadn't really full control and knowledge of how the work process was organized because workers were designing their own tools, they were craftsmen or craftspeople who were able to control the process from start to finish. So managers were merely overseeing, but they were really not experts. And so what happened with Taylor's intervention is that management became a science, became a rational process where predictability, calculation, all of those things that Max Weber talked about in a bureaucratic society that are necessary to run large industries, businesses, and to manage complex social systems. All of those things were put into place in relation to making factories and other industrial systems more effective and more efficient. And what we see in the human relations theory of management, the studies that took place at the Hawthorne Western electric plants, what happened was a real transformation. You know, the studies in the beginning were not aimed at really discovering or making the workers' situation more comfortable, but they were actually aimed at very much like what, let's say, Taylor might have done, to try to figure out how to make the work process more efficient, more profitable, and also they were concerned with the comfort and level of workers. And so what happened in the Hawthorne studies was something very interesting. So in the telephone wiring room you had women working, and you had a control and you had an experimental group, and so the first effort was centered around finding out what were the optimal conditions in which these women could work and have a better result and have a process that could be considered more efficient. And so what happened that was unexpected, and that's called, you probably heard that term before, the Hawthorne effect. What happened was that the women, as a result of the experimental condition, changed their behavior. So they began working more efficiently, they began becoming more productive, they were enjoying their work. It was a very unexpected situation. And what happened, again, this was a study of illumination conditions, and so they altered the lighting, the level of lighting in each situation. And what happened, they found that when they improved lighting conditions, when they degraded lighting conditions, no matter what they did, the workers, the women in this case, as they called them girls, became more and more efficient and more productive. And so the experimenters couldn't figure out, because logically, when you improve conditions, yes, there can be better productivity, but when you degrade conditions and you have less light and they could barely see, still they were performing much above average. And their performance was enhanced and increasingly efficient. So what was the reason for this? And that was the important finding in the Hawthorne experiments. The important finding was that the human element, that paying attention to people, making them feel important, talking to them. The women underwent medical tests every 6 weeks, I believe, to see their condition. So for the first time, they were not completely under that scientific management kind of system that they were accustomed to before, but now they were being treated as important individuals. And that's what the experimenters found out later. Elton Mayo was the lead person in this study. That's what they found out later, that giving attention, taking into account the workers' needs, the workers' levels of motivation, allowing them to express themselves, allowing them to have a part in the work process, which had been taken away from them during the scientific management kinds of innovations, because workers were thought to just be able to perform tasks, and the managers were the brains, the intelligent part of the company, the people who would be able to figure out the projects and assign them accordingly. And so this was an inversion of that kind of logic. But what's important also to remember when you read about the Human Relations School, even though it was a focus for the first time on the employees, there was still that same logic of control. So now, if you think about it in that way, it's interesting, because where Taylor wanted to control the worker by not giving him any information, by treating him in a way stripped of any kind of humanity for the most part. Not to say that Taylor didn't do things that were good for the worker. He's also the father of ergonomics. He also cared very much and felt that managers should be fair to workers. So we have to remember that he had some good goals as well, but what happened, as we saw in that film Human Resources, oftentimes managers took advantage. So they benefited from the more efficient kind of, the time motion studies that figured out just how much time it took to do a job, but then they cut the amount of workers. They made them speed up the work process. They paid them lower wages. So those are things that Taylor never would have advocated, which is important to remember. But Taylor's logic of control, right, management as a process of control, is not so different in the human relations theory of management, but now the control is on a human level. So you want to know who the worker is, you want to understand his or her psychology, you want to take him as a whole individual person, but you still want to control the person. So I think you'll see in later readings that, and maybe your experiences in some organizations would be similar, that now a person's whole life, their emotions, their talents, their interests become connected to the job, so that you bring more than just, in the scientific management approach, no one cares about your family life, your goals, your individual wants or desires. You're only seen as somebody who is there to perform a certain function. And when Max Weber talked about bureaucracy, remember how the personal aspects get filtered out. So now with the human relations approach to management and later approaches, the individual is expected to fully engage with the company, to adopt the values, the norms, to become a full participant in the organizational life. So that has very good benefits on the one hand, but you could also make the argument that there is still a kind of manipulation, but a different level, an emotional, psychological, versus just a kind of technical type of manipulation. So enjoy the readings, and I will talk to you about further topics next time. Thanks.